right, so hello everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Brielle and I'm one of the organizers for the Quantitative Seminar series this year. And I'll begin with a land acknowledgement. The Coast Salish peoples of this land, the land which touches the shared waters of all tribes and bands within the Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. And we also acknowledge that we live and work on the ancestral lands of the Duwamish people, the first people of Seattle. So Brett asked for a short introduction and will be introduced as such. Brett McClintock is a research statistician in the Marine Mammal Laboratory at the NOAA-NMFS Alaska Fisheries Science Center in Seattle. He is an affiliate member in the UW School of Environmental and Forestry Sciences. He earned his PhD in wildlife biology and MS in statistics at Colorado State University. His research focuses on the development and application of statistical models for ecological data, with a primary focus on marine mammals. He is the creator and maintainer of the Animal Movement R package, Momentu HMM, and the Spatial capture-recapture R package, Multimark. He also co-authored the book, Animal Movement Statistical Models for Telemetry Data. So that's it, and I guess I'll let you go. Take it away, Brett, and I can answer some quick questions if any people have them in the chat as Brett is talking, and we can have more in-depth questions after the talk. So thanks, and you can take it away.
Well, thanks very much for the lengthy introduction. Didn't ask for that. You guys asked me for a bio. I didn't realize you were going to read all that. I would have kept it much shorter, but thank you for that. I appreciate it. And thank you also for the invitation. I really enjoy this seminar series, and it's been a couple of years since I've given one, so I'm really excited to be participating in this series again. And I'm also really excited today because I'm going to talk about integrating two of my favorite topics in statistical ecology in terms of methods, and those are capture-recapture and animal movement modeling. And before I start, I'd like to acknowledge my colleagues in this work. We actually held a workshop in the building where this series usually takes place, in the SAFS building. So we held a workshop in the pre-COVID days on integrating animal movement and spatial capture-recapture, or SEECR. And some of our participants were Richard Chandler, Sarah Converse, Devin Johnson, Beth Gardner, Nathan Hostetter, Brianna Abrams, and Robbie Emmett. So some familiar faces to all of you. So I'd like to thank them again. Their contributions have been pivotal to this work. So thank you to them. And there's one person that was there that was not able to be in this photo, and that was Paul Kahn, who is in the same lab as me. So here's a photo of Paul sneaking up on some poor elephant seals, but in the interest of science. So there's Paul. So the fields of capture-recapture and spatial capture-recapture in particular, and animal movement modeling, have really exploded in the last 10 or 15 years. There's now entire books devoted to the topics, and there's been a ton of development and new applications, but these have largely been kept separate. So what I'm going to talk about today is the potential to integrate these two approaches. So I'll begin by providing kind of a quick overview and review of recent developments in spatial capture-recapture, and then also some developments in animal movement modeling. And then I'll talk about the potential for integrating these methods and the potential advantages this may bring, but I'll also discuss the numerous challenges and difficulties that combining these two methodologies may present. So in many cases, combining things is a good thing. You put them together and they're better. And sorry, I'm realizing now I originally put these slides together for a British audience, but I hope they're still relevant to a more American audience. But anyway, you get the idea. Sometimes you put things together and they're better, but in some cases, combining things maybe isn't such a great idea. And apologies to George Clooney, who I understand actually uses the Flowbee. But what I'm hoping to motivate you and maybe convince you of today is that integrating animal movement into spatial capture-recapture models may actually be a good thing. So first, an introduction to spatial capture-recapture. And I'm going to try and keep this fairly light and quick. I'm kind of assuming you guys are familiar with these methods, but if something isn't clear or you want a little more detail on anything, please feel free to ask. So spatial capture-recapture, or SEECR, is primarily concerned with population level processes, and a lot of applications are interested in like abundance or relative, abundance or density, and but they can also be used for demographic rates like survival. A really nice thing about SEECR, it has this really well-defined population in both space and time, and that's because it models detection probability as this decreasing function of where your trap or detectors are relative to where the animals are. And that's a really nice property. Now standard SEECR models don't have an explicit movement model. They rely on these kind of population level Eulerian formulations of space usage. And in the standard models, this is what it looks like. So it's kind of this bivariate normal thing where we have our location at any time t is normally distributed with a mean at the activity center or home range center of an individual. And then the scale of that usage around the activity center is determined by this sigma det parameter. And in the standard SEECR literature, this is usually just denoted as sigma, but today I'm going to use sigma det for that parameter. And one thing to note is that your location at any time, as we go through time, all these locations are considered to be independent. So no matter where you just were, you could be anywhere in that bivariate normal distribution around the activity center. And I'll point out later why this may be problematic. This is what a kind of standard SEECR model could look like, like heuristically. We'll break it up into two components. The first is what I'll call the SEECR component, and this is the model for the spatial encounter histories, Y. And this is a function of our activity centers and then some other observation process parameters. Now, the other component is a point process model for the density and distribution of these activity centers. More specifically, if we look at the point process model, what's often done is this is broken up conditionally. And then for the activity centers, it's often assumed that they're just uniformly distributed in what's called the state space. And the state space is an area prescribed by the user where they believe that's relevant to their study area. So the activity centers are assumed that they could be anywhere uniformly distributed throughout this entire area. And for abundance, it's common to use something like a Poisson model, where it has this intensity parameter, lambda, for the intensity and density of the activity centers within that entire state space. So a fairly simple point process model is kind of used in the standard SEECR model. And then for the detection model, what's commonly used is a Bernoulli distribution. There's other options, including Poisson and some others. But in the Bernoulli case, what we're saying here is that an animal can be detected or not at trap J at time T. And then this probability of detection is a function of the location of a trap and the location of an animal's activity center. And here's where we see that sigma det parameter that enters into the detection function there. So you can imagine as an activity center gets farther away from a trap, the animal is less likely to be detected, right? So this sigma det parameter can be useful for inferences about home range under some fairly restrictive assumptions. Now, these are that the activity centers do not move, that the home ranges are symmetric, and that space is used independently within the entire home range. Now, these are fairly restrictive assumptions for free living organisms that are responding to internal and external drivers. So oftentimes when those are violated, the sigma det parameter is no longer interpretable, no longer biologically interpretable. Now, fortunately, point estimates of abundance or density are generally robust to violations of some of these assumptions. For example, if we have non-circular home ranges or a dynamic activity centers, so activity centers that move, the density or abundance tends not to be biased, but the uncertainty can be underestimated, and that can be problematic. Now, if we have non-random space use, though, that can induce all sorts of problems, including bias in abundance, density, survival, detection function parameters. Another issue is it can induce sensitivity to the user-specified state space. So those are both fairly problematic. And then lastly, because there's no explicit movement model, any spatiotemporal correlation and detections that are attributable to movement are not accounted for. So if you imagine, like yesterday you caught an animal at a trap right here, the next day you might expect to catch the animal at the same trap or maybe a nearby trap, right? But standard seeker models do not account for that correlation. And the result of that, again, could be uncertainty being underestimated. So there have been some extensions to seeker models to try and account for this kind of inhomogeneous space usage. And the way it's typically done is they incorporate more complexity into either the detection function or the point process model. And two notable extensions involve resource selection functions, which are commonly used for animal movement modeling, and I'll talk more about those later. And another one that's pretty interesting are these, what's called a least cost path, and that can get at things like landscape connectivity. But again, there's no explicit movement model here used. They incorporate these either into the detection function itself or the point process model. Now, this is not the first time that anyone has ever thought about incorporating a movement model into seeker. There have been some really basic Lagrangian or individual level movement models that have been incorporated into seeker, but these have all been simple random walks, which is basically the most simple individual level movement model you can have. But they have been useful, and they've been used in open population models to account for activity centers that can move from season to season or year to year. And several folks have done this, including Beth Gardner and Richard Glennie at University of St. Andrews, and then Murray Efford and Matt Schofield at the University of Otago. A simple random walk has also been incorporated into closed population models to account for transients that just kind of pass through the study area. And Andy Royal did that a couple of years ago. The one thing to note here, though, or two things. One, that these models have all been simple random walks, so not the most realistic of movement models. And also, they don't provide a coherent scaling from the individual level movement process to the population level utilization distribution or density surface. So that's my background on seeker. Please ask questions if that wasn't enough, but if not, or if so, I'll move on to describing a little bit about animal movement. So as with seeker, animal movement modeling has also really exploded in the last 10 to 15 years. And this has also coincided with recent technological advances in animal-borne biotelemetry. And it seems now you can get really high resolution data collected from all sorts of animals in all sorts of places at any time. So in a way, it's almost like we're getting too much data now, but I think that's a good problem to have. Sorry, my child just knocked on my door. So one common model that's used in animal movement is what's called a resource selection function. And these are just spatial point process models, and they're used for inferring the habitat utilization distribution. And a very common form for this point process model is just this logistic looking thing where the utilization distribution is a function of some habitat covariates that we believe are important to our study. Yeah, sorry.
I'm so sorry.
It's okay. Sorry about that. So we have our habitat covariates that we think are important, and then we have the associated resource selection coefficients that tell us, that indicate whether an animal selects for or avoids a certain area. Now, this in itself isn't a movement model, but there are some Lagrangian movement models that give rise to the expected utilization distribution when this scaled up in both time and space. And what I mean there was if we let enough time go by that we forget all of our previous locations, this Lagrangian model will converge to the utilization distribution. Now, not all movement models have a limiting distribution like this, but some do. And that'll be a large focus of my talk today, are these individual-based movement models that in the limiting case, give rise to a utilization distribution. So this is, I'll get into some Lagrangian movement models now, and I'll use what I'll call basic building blocks of random walks to illustrate how we can build more complex movement models using some standard approaches out there. So what I mean by random walk is that our location at any time t is a function of our previous location. So that's what makes it a random walk. And then the scale of this movement is determined by this sigma matrix here. And here we're assuming normality, but there's other distributions that could potentially be used there. The nice thing about random walks is you can take these different building blocks and accommodate all sorts of different types of movement. So you can have biased movements towards the center of attraction, you could have correlated movement, you could have different movement behavior modes like foraging or transit or resting or migration. You can also incorporate resource selection and even responses to environmental gradients so that the animal will immediately respond to the environment around it. So you can get a lot of ecological realism into these models by adding these additional components. And now just to give you guys some illustrations here, starting on the left here, this is just a simple random walk. And this is what has previously been used in some seeker models. And this is where your next location is entirely determined by your previous location and that sigma scale parameter. However, we can get a quite different looking trajectory when we incorporate directional persistence. So this is a correlated random walk here on the right, where you can clearly see there's a directional persistence in the movements. And then you can see the scale of the movement often also gets larger as we incorporate this directional persistence. Now in this one, here we have on the left a biased random walk. And what's going on here is there is a central tendency towards the origin, so that as the animal tends to move away from the origin, it'll then be compelled to move back. So you can think of the center here as like a center of attraction or maybe an activity center. And it keeps the movement around that area. Now, if we combine the biased random walk with a correlated random walk, so putting those two building blocks together, we can get the biased correlated random walk. So here we still have that central tendency towards the origin, but the movements are allowed to be more correlated. So with these building blocks, you can take whatever pieces you want and build as complex of a movement model as you want. And just to illustrate two examples of some more complex models, here on the left, we have a state switching correlated random walk. So in this case, I'm saying there's two states, which I'll call encamped and exploratory. And in the encamped state, in the darker shade here, there's no directional persistence and the step lengths are very short. So you can think of that like resting or foraging for some species. But then when it switches to the correlated exploratory state, we can see there's directional persistence and it's moving a lot faster. So you can capture two different behaviors there by using a state switching model. And then lastly on the right here, this is a correlated random walk with a potential function. And potential functions are pretty neat. You can imagine a marble rolling along like a hilly surface. Okay, so you're kind of you're borrowing stuff from physics here to try to describe how animals move. And it moves according to the environmental gradients. Okay, so the gradients are what define that surface that the marble is rolling along. And in this example here, we're having like favorable habitat being the white shaded areas, and then unfavorable habitat is the more darker shades. So by using the gradient of that habitat covariate, basically there's a hill there where as it gets darker and it's pushing the animal down away from that unfavorable habitat. So with potential functions, you can get a lot more environmental and environmental realism and explicitly incorporate habitat that affects the way the animal moves. And one like kind of classic example of where this is useful is for a marine mammal that won't go up onto land. So this would be one way to prevent a marine mammal from going up onto land through the use of this potential function. Now as a more concrete example, here's what a biased random walk with a center of attraction looks like. So you can see here the location at time t is a function of the previous location, but now we're going to have this bias towards what I'm calling a center of attraction A. And the strength of this bias is determined by this parameter rho, and it can range between 0 and 1. If rho is 0, we just revert back to a simple random walk. But then as rho goes to 1, we basically have movement that just beelines straight towards that center of attraction. Okay, and we still have the scale of the movement being determined by this sigma parameter. And again, the sigma parameter is not to be confused with the sigma det parameter in Seeker. So for the movement, we'll always use sigma today. And the center of attraction can be thought of as a home range center or an activity center. The nice property of this model is it does have a limiting distribution. And it's, so again, if we let enough time go by that we forget all of our previous locations, it converges to a normal distribution with a mean at the center of attraction. And then the scale of that distribution is determined by the rho and the sigma parameter. And this may look a little familiar from an earlier slide, because it turns out that this is the limiting distribution that's used in a Seeker model. So if we envision A as our activity center, we can also have our sigma det, which is a function of rho and sigma. So this shows that the underlying model of space usage in standard Seeker models is just the limiting distribution of a biased random walk with a center of attraction. Okay. So another interesting movement model that I think might be really useful for integrating Seeker and animal movement is the habitat-driven Langevin diffusion. And apologies for the French speakers out there, I can't pronounce Langevin properly, so I'm just going to say it in the English way, so apologies. This was developed by Théo Michelot and colleagues back in 2019. And it's a pretty neat model. So this is what it looks like, and it uses potential functions. So you can see here, we're taking the gradient of our habitat covariates. So that's kind of that hilly surface that our marble is rolling along. And then we still just have our habitat coefficients in there. But it has a very special form. And it turns out that with this model, the limiting distribution is the standard form of a resource selection function. So if you recall when I showed a resource selection function earlier, it's this logistic looking thing. Okay, so what this model has is a really nice scaling from an individual level process, which is movement, to a population level utilization distribution. Okay, and that's a really nice property, and I'll talk more about that later. So a few final comments on animal movement. Most applications, especially when it comes to telemetry data, they're concerned with individual level movement processes. So interested in home range or revisitation or resource selection or behavior. These models are sometimes used for population level inference, but the downside of that is that the population is often poorly defined in space and time in animal movement applications, primarily in telemetry studies. And the reason for that is that, catching animals is hard, and the animals that we catch are often the animals that we can catch, right? So as hard as we try, it often turns out that we get the ones that are closest to roads or ports or trails, and we don't have a ton of control over the animals that we can capture. And as a result, we don't necessarily really know what our population is when we have these potential sampling biases in the telemetry tagging process. And that's of no fault of our own. It's just that it's really hard to get like random samples of telemetred individuals. Now, there could be some ways that we could account for some of these biases, but it would likely require some changes to the sampling protocols that we use and capture work. So now I'm going to move on to the potential for integrating Seeker and animal movement, and I'll propose that it possibly could be the best of both worlds. So one thing is that it could potentially solve deficiencies within each field. So it could provide more ecological and behavioral realism to Seeker, and it could provide a really well-defined population in space and time for animal movement. As I hinted at before, it could also provide a nice coherent framework for scaling from individual level data up to population level processes. In terms of conservation and management, it also could help improve our inferences. So whether it's reducing bias or increasing precision, we work very hard to get the data we have and we have to make difficult decisions based on those data. So any improvement we can get in those inferences would help for species conservation and management, help make those decisions perhaps a little more certain, or at least as certain as we can get, right? So any improvement there would be nice. And these models have the potential to help reduce bias and increase precision. But perhaps most exciting, and I'm not going to say important, but most exciting, is that by integrating these two fields, we might be able to get new ecological insights at the interface of population, movement, and landscape ecology. So this is a figure we put together for a paper that was accepted in Ecology a few months ago. And it's just sort of showing like the superstructure of ecology as, you know, starting from intrinsic and extrinsic factors up to the individual level, and then up to the population level, up to the community ecosystem level, all the way up, and then the feedback loop back. So animal movement and seeker inference primarily focuses at the individual level here and up to the population level. But the way they do this is largely distinct. Seeker largely focuses on performance and fitness at the individual level, so things like survival, recruitment, or body condition. Whereas movement modeling focuses on movement and space use, so things like revisitation, resource selection, home range size, dispersal, behavior. And then using separate methods, they do arise or give rise to population level inferences, but they're again separate. So seeker can also often get at population dynamics, and immigration and emigration, birth and mortality rates, whereas the population level inference from movement models tends to be more utilization distribution. So by integrating movement and seeker, this may allow us to link all of these together. So we could see how and test how movement and space use affect performance and fitness, and then how do these scale up to the population level in things like population dynamics, immigration, birth rates, utilization distributions, and ultimately density and distribution. So there's a whole slew of new hypotheses we could potentially address by integrating these two and linking them. And then these inferences could be carried up to the community level, even the ecosystem level. So it's one piece of the puzzle here, but we could try and help unify at least this segment of the figure, and then we can leave the higher levels for another time. So what would an integrated seeker animal movement model look like? Heuristically, this is one way it could look. So we still have our seeker model and our point process model, but now we're going to stick in a movement model here. And as a reminder, mu here are the true positions of the animal through time. And we're now going to have mu1, which is our initial position of the animal. So one thing you'll notice now is that we no longer have activity centers up here. We have the true locations. So now our detection probabilities are going to be modeled as a function of the location of the detector and the specific location of the animal at a given time. And again, instead of modeling the activity centers in our point process model, this point process model will describe the density and distributions of the initial locations of the animal at the start of the study. So if I haven't emphasized it enough, there's no more activity centers now that we're going to model the latent trajectory of an individual through time. So just to show what this kind of looks like, in the top left panel here, we have a standard seeker model where our activity centers here in purple are distributed in the landscape, where here density is indicated by the shading, where white is low density and dark is higher density. And in standard seeker, when we get a detection, here we have our traps, which are the crosses here. It's just modeled as the distance from the activity center to the trap, all right? Oh, and I should mention here, the shaded purple ones indicate detections, and then the unshaded ones do not, and the orange lines are the trap that the individual was detected at. But now when we move to a seeker model with movement, we have the entire trajectory of the animals through time. So now when we get a detection, it's about where the animal was at the time of detection. So the animal's trajectory would have to get close enough to a trap in order to be detected, okay? So no more activity center, and we're focusing on that whole trajectory during the period of sampling. But maybe you're saying, hey, I like activity centers. They can be indicative of home range and behaviors like territoriality. Well, that's not a problem. We could still have activity centers in the conventional sense, but we'll call them centers of attraction here. And we can do that by including another point press model for the centers of attraction. Okay. Now, this could be really interesting in terms of the ecology, because the point process model for the activity center can be used to address hypotheses related to second order resource selection. And what second order selection is how does an animal choose its home range in a landscape? Okay, so that's a broader scale. But the point process model for the initial locations can get at third order selection, which how does an animal use space within its home range? So it's pretty interesting that we could try and tease those two types of selection out. So before we get too excited, I think it is time for a reality check here, though. It's very easy to throw up these heuristic equations and say all these great things we could do, but these models are going to present a lot of challenges and difficulties. So I think it's important that we now pump the brakes a little bit and go over some of those challenges. So the first one that I'm sure some of you have already thought of during this talk is data requirements. Do we know if seeker data could even support these types of models? You know, we're talking about fairly complex movement models. Can seeker data support those? And if not, how would we integrate seeker data with, say, auxiliary location data from telemetry devices? It's not exactly clear how one would go about doing that. Another issue is how to formulate these models in both space and time. Should they be discrete or continuous in time, discrete or continuous space, maybe some combination of those? What I'm largely going to do today is focus on discrete time and continuous space, mostly because historically both seeker and animal movement modeling have tended to be in discrete time and space. But for these types of models in particular, continuous time may be particularly advantageous. I won't get into continuous time too much today, but maybe if we have time at the end, we can talk about why those might be a good idea for some of these models. But anyway, this is wide open. We're not sure the best way to formulate these models. Another issue once we introduce movement is the state space. So if animals are moving, they could potentially leave our state space, and that's problematic. And then if animals are moving also, how big does this state space need to be? And is that going to come at a heavy computational cost? We're not sure. So that's another consideration that we need to think about. And then lastly, and perhaps most challenging, is model fitting. Some folks might say that activity centers were already hard enough to deal with, but now we're talking about integrating over an entire latent movement path. So that's a lot of latent variables. It's also not clear how to formulate these likelihoods in terms of whether we use a complete data likelihood or maybe a semi-complete data likelihood. They both have advantages and disadvantages, and we're not sure which one could be best here. And also, you know, how long are these things going to take to fit? You know, we got a lot of latent variables. It's pretty complex. These data can be pretty sparse. How long are these going to take to fit, and are they going to behave well? So lots of questions there. So faced with all these difficulties and challenges, let's start simple. And this is going to build off work that Andy Royal did a few years ago and some recent work that Beth Gardner led, looking at kind of simple scenarios, but that are integrating movement models into seeker. And by simple, what I mean is we're going to assume a closed population and that we have either seeker data alone or seeker data combined with some auxiliary telemetry data. We're going to do it in discrete time. So what that means is we're no longer able to model the instantaneous locations of individuals, which is mu. We're going to have to shift that to the expected location of an individual during some discrete interval of time. Okay, so I'll denote those expected locations as S. And you'll note now that instead of mu's up here, we have the S's. So again, that is the expected location during the interval from discrete occasion 1 to discrete occasion 2, okay? We're going to keep it in continuous space. And we're going to focus on complete data likelihoods that can be fit using data augmented Bayesian MCMC. So just to illustrate what a few movement models might look like when we're integrating them into Seeker in this discrete time framework. A simple random walk, again, is the simplest movement model you can have. And here you can just assume the expected location at time t is normally distributed with mean at the previous location, and then the scale of the movement determined by our sigma parameter. Now, one downside of this model is it has no limiting distribution. So what do we do for the point process model? What we could do is, and what is usually done, is we just assume that the expected locations are uniformly distributed in the state space. And then for abundance, we use the standard data augmented binomial model, where M is an index chosen by the user that's larger than what we think the abundance would be. And then we have an inclusion parameter size. So that this is the kind of the standard data augmented point process model that's used in Bayesian analysis for standard Seeker models. Now, if we go to the correlated random walk, we're now going to have some directional persistence, which we accomplished through this part here, where we have this new directional persistence parameter gamma, and everything else is the same. But again, no limiting distribution, so we're probably stuck with our kind of standard point process model for the activity centers, for the expected locations and abundance. But if we switch to the habitat-driven Langevin model, here's what it looks like again. The nice thing about this model is it does have a limiting distribution, and that limiting distribution is the standard form of a resource selection function. So we can use that utilization distribution as the point process model for our initial expected locations. So we have a coherent framework from the individual level of movements up to the population level utilization distribution. We can also incorporate this into our model for abundance, which looks really, really ugly. But since it's this free parameter here, it turns out that this is basically equivalent to your standard binomial data augmented model. So yeah, so we can simplify things a bit by doing that. And just to give you guys a sense for the differences between these models in the context of capture-recapture, here we have our trapping arrays indicated by the crosses, and the orange guys have been detected and the purplish guys have not. So here we can see our simple random walk in the top left. The top right, we have a correlated random walk, so we can see the scale of movement is greater, and there's directional persistence in the track. And then at the bottom here, we have that habitat-driven Langevin diffusion. Now this is just with a single covariate, so that single covariate constitutes the utilization distribution here, where lighter is less favorable and darker is more favorable. So we would expect this model, again, it's a marble rolling along a hill, so the tracks are going to tend to congregate and move around the darker areas. That is the population level utilization distribution, or density surface in this case. So returning to this figure again, you know, the data here are not any different than a standard Seeker model for now. Okay, so it's just, if it's like Bernoulli, we just have our zeros and ones. We haven't changed anything in terms of the data, but we have a much more complicated model. You know, are Seeker data going to be able to support these more complicated models? It's possible they might, but if not, we could incorporate auxiliary location data. And when we're in discrete time, this wouldn't be too complicated if we don't have any measurement error. So let's say we have really high quality GPS telemetry to coincide with our Seeker data. If we observe the true location at some time tau during our discrete time interval, we could just then model that with using a normal distribution that's centered around the expected location of the animal at time t. And then that scale is determined by our sigma depth parameter. So that's fairly straightforward to incorporate those. Now, if we have error associated with our locations, we can still do that. It's not too bad. But now that we observe some location u at time tau, but we know it's not the true location. So what we could do is split up this new component of our model into two parts, and then model the observed location based on the latent true location, and then model the latent true location as a function of the expected location. So a little more complicated, but still doable. So Beth Gardner, in her paper, led a simulation study kind of addressing some of these challenges and difficulties, but again, starting simple and just seeing, how these models would perform kind of in some good case scenarios. So again, it was a closed population, and a 10 by 10 square trap array was used. This is in discrete time, so 2 categories of occasions was used, either 15 or 25. And then for the seeker model, a Poisson distribution was used with rate parameter lambda. So the detection rate is this parameter lambda here, and as before, its model is a function of the location of the trap and the expected location of an individual at time t. And as you'd expect, that declines as the current location gets farther away from a particular trap. And those 3 movement models were used. So a simple random walk, a correlated random walk, and then the Langevin model with a single habitat covariate. And these were all fitted using data augmented Bayesian MC using the Nimble software. So a bunch of scenarios were looked at. For the simple random walk, we varied the sigma parameter, which is the movement parameter, the sigma depth parameter, which is the seeker parameter, and then lambda naught, which is the baseline detection rate. And then the number of occasions was varied between 25 and 15. And then for these scenarios, no auxiliary data was available. For the correlated random walk model, we now introduce an additional parameter gamma, which is that directional persistence parameter. And then only 25 occasions were used for all of these scenarios. But then we looked at scenarios both with and without auxiliary location data. And then for the Langevin scenarios, we got all the same parameters as the simple random walk, but then we also have this resource selection coefficient delta, and these varied between kind of a high selection and a lower selection. And then 25 occasions here, and then no auxiliary location data were included in those scenarios. So now moving on to some results here. For the simple random walk, we're going to focus on the movement parameters sigma and the detection parameter sigma det. And what we see here is that the model was easily able to disentangle these 2 parameters, and they were estimated well in all scenarios. And one thing I'll note here is these with the T15 suffix, those are the ones that only include 15 occasions, as opposed to these occasions without the suffix that contain 25 occasions. And we really didn't see a difference by lowering the number of occasions. And none of this was actually really surprising. Andy Royal, in his paper in 2016, had demonstrated in some limited cases that this model could be estimated using seeker data alone, and this study affirms that finding. It gets a little more interesting when we look at the correlated random walk. So in these scenarios, we found that seeker data alone did fine in terms of the movement and detection parameters, and I should say movement scale parameter, sigma, but it had trouble with that gamma parameter. Gamma is that directional persistence parameter, and we found that when there was no auxiliary data, so that's these scenarios that don't have an A suffix, it tended to underestimate that directional persistence. But then once we include the auxiliary location data, and it didn't require a lot, but once that was included, we can see that it captures that gamma parameter much, much better. So these are the scenarios with the A suffix. And the reason we think the simulations that did not use auxiliary location data did not perform well here is because the correlated random walk kind of like follows the persistence from one time step to the next time step to the next time step. So it's trying to get a feel for how the track kind of stays consistent between 3 or more time steps. And in these simulations, we usually got about 23 or 24 individuals that were detected at least once. And then of those individuals that were detected, they were detected maybe like 4 or 5 times on average, which is really good for seeker data. But when you're trying to get movement at a really fine scale from one time step to another, you actually don't get that many detections that are in a row in time. So we think that when you need a higher resolution in terms of the consecutive detections in order to really get at that directional persistence parameter. And when you do include the location data, which has that resolution, then that parameter is much easier to recover. Lastly, for the Langevin model here, we see again that the movement scale parameter sigma and the detection parameter sigma det were well recovered. And exciting for us was that the resource selection coefficient delta was recovered in all scenarios examined. And I want to emphasize here that this was based on seeker data alone. There was no auxiliary location data here, but the models had no problem recovering that resource selection coefficient. So I haven't said anything about abundance or density from these simulations, but they were all estimated well in these scenarios, and that really wasn't surprising. These models are more about new inferences related to movement and relating that to the population level processes. So we didn't expect like abundance to be greatly improved by the movement model, but we wanted to see if we could learn more from these data by adding an additional movement component. So abundance and density were well estimated, and that really wasn't a surprise. We found that all the parameters were easily recoverable from seeker data alone when using the simple random walk or the Langevin model. But we did find that seeker data alone struggled with that correlated random walk, and it greatly benefited by including additional location data. And these improvements were in all the parameters. So the parameters were better estimated with those auxiliary data. And then importantly, the mixing of the MCMC was much, much improved if you included those additional data. So we learned a bit there about the limits of the seeker data alone and the advantages that auxiliary location data may provide. So some wrap-ups from the simulation study is that, I mean, this is kind of neat because the movement models that we're looking at here have been developed and typically applied to telemetry data. But what we found was that these movement models that have always been applied to telemetry data can actually be informed by seeker data. So it's kind of like you can get two birds with one stone here. With seeker data, you can get at both the movement process and the abundance or density process. So that's really neat. And as a consequence of that, the movement parameters are well-defined or apply to a well-defined population in both space and time. When we just use telemetry data, again, because of the way we tag the individuals, we don't always have that. But when we integrate movement into seeker, we have population level movement parameters that are well-defined. So that's really neat, I think. But one caveat to all this is that these were pretty decent seeker data sets. We didn't test the limits of what these what the data could support. We kept things pretty good here. We had a few scenarios where the capture rate was low, but it was never like, you know, one of those cases where you've got like 3 detections of tigers over like 4 months or something like that. We didn't try that, and those would probably struggle here. But that leads me to a good point that, you know, we're starting to collect so much telemetry data these days that it's becoming more readily available to be used as a prior or to otherwise inform these models. And I don't think that's a bad thing, or it's not like cheating. It's just as we learn more about how animals move, we can use that information to help inform these models when we have sparser seeker data. So it's still early days. We've learned a little bit from the simulations that we conducted. You know, we've learned a little bit about the data requirements. In terms of the spatial temporal formulation, you know, this is wide open. We focused on discrete time and continuous space, but again, there could be a lot of good reasons that these could be or should be formulated in continuous time, and especially when we're trying to integrate kind of the seeker data and location data that are collected at very different temporal scales. That's where continuous time may be really advantageous. And again, I'm sorry I didn't get to talk about that too much today, but if we have time, I'm happy to discuss it. In terms of the state space, we didn't really run into problems in the scenarios we looked at, but I could see areas where this would be problematic. So an example would be species or individuals that move a great distance, like polar bears. The size of the state space and keeping them in the state space may be more of an issue. And finally, with model fitting, I mean, this is super wide open. We used Bayesian MCMC with a complete data likelihood. I'm sure that algorithm could still be improved. There could also be other approaches like a semi-complete data likelihood, which can have advantages, especially if you have a really, really large state space or a really large population. There also could be maximum likelihood methods that could be used here, which may be fairly efficient. And there's some new techniques like spatial hidden Markov models that rely on sparse matrices that could also speed these up and make them more efficient. And then in our simulations, we actually found that these didn't take that long to fit. You know, we're talking on the order of a few hours, and I think in the worst case was maybe like 6 or 8 hours. I don't know, I'll have to ask that. But they weren't really that bad. But I could envision these getting worse, especially as the models get more complex and we have larger data and larger populations. So that area is wide open. So if you're a student or a postdoc or a researcher looking for a new and exciting area to work on, this is wide open. So to wrap up here, I hope I have convinced at least some of you that integrating seeker and movement modeling could be a good thing. Again, it can potentially solve deficiencies in both fields, and that is more realism into seeker and a well-defined population into animal movement modeling. It could be helpful for conservation and management if we can get these estimates to be more precise and less biased. And you know, maybe most exciting is just the path to new hypotheses and insights that we could get at that interface of population movement and landscape ecology. So there's tons more to do. I'm excited. I hope you are too. And again, I would love to discuss any of this with you guys. And I hope you will view the integration of these two methods kind of like this and recognize that combining seeker and animal movement can lead us down a path of exciting and new inferences that we wouldn't be able to get using either method on its own. So with that, I'd like to thank my collaborators again. And this whole talk has basically been a plug for a special feature that's coming out in ecology. It's called Linking Capture, Recapture, and Movement. And the papers are just starting to trickle out now. And I relied heavily on 2 of those papers today. One of this is McClintock et al., which was published a couple months ago in Ecology. And the other is this one led by Beth Gardner that is under review. And with that, thank you.
Awesome, thank you so much. That was a great talk. Just a reminder for people in the audience, you can ask questions in the question box, or you can use the raise your hand feature and I can unmute you for any questions that you have. Again, awesome, great talk. Seems like a cool addition to the integrated population model suite world. So that seems great. I'll just wait as people come in with questions. Okay, if there's no questions, I'm going to ask a question first then. I was wondering, in your auxiliary location model addition that you had in your last couple, yeah, that whole process, I wanted to ask about change when you convert this whole system into a continuous time, how would that auxiliary location model be affected by that?
So yeah, it would be less clunky for sure. You know, I think that continuous time is the way to go for this. We didn't do that here because we wanted to keep it simple and it was a simulation study. But in real life, you know, these auxiliary locations could be coming in at any time. And we really do, we want to model the instantaneous locations. We don't want to model these S's, which is the expected location over some interval, right? So yeah, if you have a continuous time model there, then you would be having the movement path be continuous. So you would have your detections at a trap that would be instantaneous. And then you would also have your locations, which would be instantaneous. And then that could all inform that detection function. So the detection function here in a continuous time model would be integrating over the whole path during like whatever interval you want. So it's it would be just a less clunky and yeah, better approach, I think. It's just, yeah, the math sometimes be a little harder, but.
Yeah, for sure. Cool, thanks. Okay, we do have one question from Trevor Branch. Trevor asks, what kind of data would you typically need to implement this?
So well, we found that you can use standard seeker data if they're good, I guess. We didn't test like really poor seeker data, but you would want like, either a trap array, any kind of spatial capture-recapture data. So like a trap array, which is the most common. But I guess there's other ones. There's kind of this observer, what's the term they use for that? Where you fly around and detect them. That's another one where you can actually model the spatial locations. So it might not be great for some species that aren't like used for seeker, like, some small mammals. Actually, they can use trapping arrays there. So I guess, yeah, what I'm trying to say is any seeker data set, if it's decent enough, you could use. And if it's not decent, then having some auxiliary information about the movement process would help.
Cool. Trevor, if that answer wasn't, if that was good enough or not good enough, you can let me know in the questions. Great. So Mark Sorrell has a question, and I sent it to you as well, Brett, if you want to see it in words. But Mark asked, are you not excited about this approach for improving estimates of abundance when you have decent telemetry data, but only a few seeker detections, like the tiger example you mentioned?
No, I mean, if you have, because people fit these models to tiger data that are really sparse, and they're very uncertain, but they do get estimates. And if you have decent telemetry data that informs that detection process, I think that would be great. It would help. Just if they're moving around and you only have a few detections, if you can actually account for how they use space more explicitly, then I think it would only help. So yes, I am excited about that.
All right, we have Devin that raised their hand. I'm gonna unmute you, hopefully. I'll see if I do this right. Sorry, 1 second. Oh, request to unmute. All right, Devin, I requested to unmute you.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hey, Brett, I was just curious. Mark mentioned about the abundance estimate, but I was curious on, was there any difference at all in those abundance estimates for the fancier movement models? I mean, even in terms of uncertainty and stuff like that, did you get reduced uncertainty even if they were all unbiased kind of a thing, or were they all pretty much the same?
I don't know if Beth is here today. I can't remember offhand. The Langevin model did have a slight positive bias, but it wasn't much. But I can't remember if they were like, if those like, credible intervals were huge. I don't think they were, or we would have noted that. But I could double check that for you.
Well, I was just curious if there was, if they were all estimating abundance well, but if there was any sort of penalty for sort of over anxiousness or, over complexity in your model.
Yeah, no, I don't remember seeing that, but I could double check in the paper. But no, I don't remember that being an issue. It didn't really affect the abundance that much, from what I remember.
Sounds good. Thanks.
Yep.
Cool. So we have another question from Dan Avondale. Dan said, great talk, very applicable to both empirical and theoretical MPA work in my case. Do you view these different model configurations as different tools with choice based more on efficiency or data, or more as alternative hypothesis about how animals move?
Is this more getting at the spatio-temporal formulation, or like the specific components, I guess is what I would need to follow that with. I'm not totally sure what.
I requested to unmute Dan, so hopefully. Oh.
Great, thanks. Yeah, great talk, Brett. Yeah, just, you present a lot of different structures here. I'm gonna mess up the names here, because my French is also poor, but it could be like this. It could be the the random walkie thing. It could be the random walk with the centroid thing, kind of all that stuff, and then kind of build this model comparison at the end. And I guess the question then being is would you view those alternative models as like different hypotheses about the way the world works, or as just kind of, I guess, alternative tools that one could use to just try and fit to movement data? I'm not sure if that question's very well posed, but
I think I understand what you mean. I mean, I'm more in the latter party, or sorry, the former party, where I view these as these are ecological questions that we're trying to address. You know, a statistician wants to fit the best model of the data, and sometimes, and I'm not accusing anyone of this, but sometimes you throw things in there because it looks like it fits better, but your inference then is then biased by you trying to overfit, you know? So I view it all, in my personal view, and this is by no means universal, but I view these as a tool to extend the ecological inferences that we can do. So if you think an animal moves a certain way or want to test whether an animal moves a certain way while accounting for the whole population level process, like I think that's where this would be neat. And you know, especially those models like the Langan and diffusion, where you can get at that resource selection. I mean, we learn a lot from that. I mean, that could be used to, you know, identify important habitat, things like that. You know, it's yeah. So I'm more about the ecology. That's what really drives me.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about this. Well, on the flip side, the fleet modeling side of things, it'd be fun to chat sometime to see if there's some synergy. So I think we're thinking the same questions. We've got a lot of ideas. Well, maybe people move like this, and yet surprising little studies of actually confronting those theories with data.
Yeah, no, I'd love to chat.
Cool, thanks.
Cool. So it seems like we don't have any more lingering questions, and it's after the time. So I just wanted to thank you again so much, Brett, for giving a talk today. Yeah, it was wonderful. And as a reminder for everyone else, we're back on next week virtually. So hopefully I see a lot of you all again next week.
Well, thank you again for having me. Yeah, thank you.